Hello, Rebels. Welcome to The Base. Steve Hilton here, along with Kristen Garcia-Dumont. And our guest today is Representative James Gallagher. He's in the Assembly, the California Assembly. He represents a district in Northern California and well-known for tragic reasons. Part of that district, town in that district, Paradise, became very well known throughout the country, sadly, for the wildfire destruction. And that's certainly something that we're going to be talking about today. But there's so much. I'm excited to welcome you to the show. Kevin Kiley was our guest for our very first episode, and you've been completely working hand in glove with him on so many things, especially the emergency powers of the governor through the pandemic. Let's start with that, because I think it comes up so often in our conversations on this show about what's going wrong and how we can put it right. And we just keep coming back to this notion of the one party rule and with the pandemic, even more, one man rule because of the way that the governor has seized powers. Just tell us a little bit about where we are now as we kind of enter the really kind of serious part of the recall on that issue of the emergency powers and your challenge to that.
Sure. Well, yeah, Kevin and I have been very busy this last year on an issue that, I wish we didn't have to be, and it's something that as we, descended into this pandemic and the response to it, we had come back into session as a legislature, and we were seeing this governor just use emergency powers to bypass the legislature entirely. Mm-hmm. And I just couldn't help but think, as I was sitting there going back to like 8th grade when we learned about the Constitution and the greatness of this country's system of government, the separation of powers, the limits on power, so that no one person or one branch of government gets too much power, because that always ends up, and our founders knew this well, that always ends up in tyranny. It ends up in corruption. It ends up in abuses to people's civil rights. I don't think it was coincidence at all that in February, right before the pandemic hit, we memorialized Japanese internment and apologized for what happened, during that time. Mm-hmm. And as I think back on that and everything that happened and transpired, it's like in so many ways we don't learn our lessons, that because we're scared or because we see some threat, we're willing to do all kinds of things that end up being, abusive, and we're willing to give over freedoms in ways that I think are very devastating. So obviously all of that culminated in us in June, after we were just seeing this happening, and last straw was really
June 2020.
Yeah, June of 2020 last year. We had just seen him do an executive order changing our election law overnight without the legislature. And it was right then that I started drafting the complaint. And I said, look, we can't stand for this. I put it together, and I called Kevin and I said, hey, what do you think about, filing this lawsuit right here in Sutter County Court? That's actually where I live. And I said, hey, I think we just file it here in state court in Sutter County and allege the violation of our constitutional separation of powers. This can't stand. And we were ready and willing to stand up and take this fight.
And for our listeners, it was a pretty extraordinary move. And the reason you guys took it on, as I understand it, and I did actually read a lot of your briefing and watched the oral arguments, both of them. The point was the legislature had plenty of time to consider this issue and change the law if it wanted to. And ultimately it did. Right. And so here's a glaring example of Gavin taking this emergency power to really change the nature of elections across the state, probably forever, and do an entire election where we push ballots out to every single citizen of the state. And whether or not that's appropriate or not is for the legislature to decide, not the executive branch. And that
when we say that, I just want to zero in on that. So we've heard that argument made at the national level, that the U.S. Constitution requires that it puts the power to determine the nature of elections in the hands of the states. Right. Is that mirrored in the California Constitution? Does the California Constitution talk about voting at all?
Well, I'm not thinking off the top of my head exactly what it says about voting, but it provides for a similar separation of powers arguably even a stronger separation of powers than the U.S. Constitution, in that it says that all powers of the legislative powers are vested in the legislature itself, and this is something that we brought up in our briefing as well, and that election law is very clearly something that is under the legislature's purview to define the dates for holding elections, the process, the procedures that we have. And previously, before Gavin issued his executive order, when it came to mail ballot voting, you had to request a mail ballot. I mean, you had to, it's not really very hard. We actually have a very high number. I think it's over 60% of our voters vote absentee already. So it's not, they've figured out how to request a mail ballot and do it very frequently. They really didn't need his help in doing that. And I mean, that's also a common theme with this governor, is he seems to have this thought that he is the only one who is wise enough and smart enough to help us through this pandemic. And that sort of the legislature is kind of a nuisance that he has to deal with. Even though we are elected members of our community and have, power vested by the Constitution to make law.
But we've talked about the electoral thing, but did you use the election argument because it was the strongest argument, or but actually you were objecting to the use of the emergency powers, not just on that issue, but across the board on things like the lockdowns? Is that correct?
Well, two things I'd point out on that is, the reason why we chose to focus in on the election law changes is because it was the most egregious act of literally changing the statute overnight by executive order. And that was very clearly, a legislative act that he had no power to do. So that's kind of why we focused in on it. He had also already changed things like landlord-tenant law, overnight. He had changed workers' compensation rules overnight that we thought were also violations of separation of powers. But, the elections one, several provisions of the elections code that he just altered with the stroke of a pen, that just seemed to be the most egregious. So we really, really honed in on it. The other thing I'd point out is we have this Emergency Services Act, and that's what he's been using. The Emergency Services Act says nothing about elections. Right. It does give him powers to coordinate resources, to respond to some kind of an emergency, to provide for, coordinating health resources and ensuring that all branches of government are working towards the goal of helping people through an emergency. But it doesn't give him power over elections at all. I mean, it never even mentions the elections code one time.
So that's what I was going to ask you about next, which is presumably you would agree that, the pandemic was an emergency and required some measure of kind of quick, decisive action in a coordinated, centralized manner. I think most reasonable people say, we can see that. And the Act provides for that. What's it called? The Emergency Services Act.
Right.
When was that? Has that been on the books for a long time in California?
It's been on the books for a long time. I think maybe during Reagan's governorship is when it was passed into law, and then there's been some modifications, over the years. But it's essentially been in the same form for decades. And
we've had this issue has come up in other states around the country, and one of the kind of points that has been part of that conversation is the timing. Is there any kind of is there a time limit in that act, in the California Emergency Services Act? Is there like you can take this power for 30 days or whatever?
No. And this is one of the problems. And Kevin and I have introduced legislation this year saying that it should be 60 days at most. And after that time, the legislature would have to, extend that time, by an affirmative vote. But unfortunately, the way it was written is it allows the governor to declare the emergency. And then under the terms of the act, he's supposed to end the emergency at the, most reasonable opportunity, which obviously he has not done.
But it's still going on, isn't it? As far as it's
still going on.
It's still in place.
Powers are still in effect. And the only way to really end it is the legislature could end it. The legislature, by a supermajority vote in both houses, could end the emergency as well, or the governor can do it. Obviously, when you have the situation that we do, where we have, a Democratic governor and a supermajority Democratic legislature, even if they maybe think he is abusing his powers, they're unlikely for political reasons to make a move to not, so that he doesn't look bad.
Why is that? That's the part that I don't really get, which is, why don't they stand up for their own rights as legislators?
It's been a frustration of mine too, and I hear the grumblings from people across the aisle, because I think they have issues and problems with this governor too. But what it boils down to is politics. I mean, there's a recall on. They don't want to be seen as undermining, their party leader, the governor of this state. And so I think that is ultimately why they don't move forward with ending the emergency. And the other thing is, I mean, obviously with the vaccination rates that we have now, the low cases that we have statewide, there is no reason to continue this emergency.
Of course not.
And we pointed out even New York has ended their emergency, so, this governor, though, likes the power. I think it's very clear that he likes having this power. He likes being seen as the only one who can really safely bring us through.
I alone can do this. I remember a certain ex-president who talked like that, and the Democrats went mad. What about...
They're not very consistent, that's for sure,
Exactly.
Right?
What is the status of your lawsuit? Where are we now on that?
So I like to say, we won the first round in the Superior Court. We were successful, got a judgment against him on appeal. And the third District Court of Appeals, they ruled in favor of the governor. He won round 2. And now we're on to round 3. We filed our petition in the California State Supreme Court. So we are hoping that the highest court in the state will just follow the Constitution. And when
is that going to be? When will it come before the court?
So it is before the court now. Uh-huh. The petition's been filed.
Right.
They have, a certain amount of time. I would anticipate within the next couple months we should hear something.
Oh my God.
In terms of a timeline for a decision, and obviously he gets a chance to say that.
They'll drag their feet. And can I rally against the second decision? I know you have to be polite because you're in the middle of it, but the second decision was ridiculous. So the second decision was the judiciary abdicating entirely their responsibility, and every citizen should have been upset about the reasoning behind that opinion. Basically, what that judge said was, well, I know I'm supposed to decide whether or not one branch has, overstepped their bounds, but legislature, just go take it back to the legislature. Assemblyman Gallagher, you're the one who passed the law. You and the Senate passed this law in the first instance. So if you hate the law, go back and change it. It was such a cowardly way out.
You mean did he meet? They refer to the Emergency Services Act?
Yes, he said go back and amend it. That's what you should do. If you have such a problem with it, go back and amend it. And the judiciary's role is to be the arbiter when two branches have some sort of conflict, and to define the roles of the two. Mm-hmm. And we've talked a little bit about this about the California Constitution, but unlike the federal Constitution, the California Constitution says that the branches are even more sort of hermetically sealed off from one another than the federal Constitution does. Mm-hmm. So there's a larger separation between the branches in California. So this should have been an easy decision for a judge to say, the executive is 100% encroaching upon the legislature's daily duties, right, without justification. And so I'm going to say, for now, I'm going to uphold the lower court's ruling, and the legislature should go and reconsider whether or not they're okay with the governor still having the power. It should have been flipped. And
they went even further, Kristen. In the written decision, they interpreted a provision of the Emergency Services Act as giving the governor in an emergency all police power of the state.
What?
All police power.
That's frightening. That sounds really authoritarian.
In the governor, and then interpreted that statute, but then didn't do the next step, which is, if that is true, I mean, if you really believe that, court, that can't possibly be constitutional, because we have this whole, many years of precedent that says, if there is such a law that gives all legislative power away, has been delegated away to another branch, that is patently unconstitutional. It would have to be struck down. And so the court, by making that interpretation and then not doing its constitutional duty to say that can't possibly be and we must strike this down as unconstitutional, just flies in the face of, I would say over 100 years of constitutional case law precedent.
And just, we have these conversations about national judicial rulings and so on. It's always pointed out, this was an Obama judge or a Trump appointed judge. But these justices, what do you call them? They're
justices.
Justices. Yeah. They are appointed by the governor. Is that right?
They're appointed by the governor, and these justices have been appointed by different governors over time.
But all
in
Democrats,
California,
are they? Are they all Democrat appointees?
No.
Okay.
At least one of them was appointed by a Republican, and I think the other two that decided the case were appointed by a Democrat governor. The other thing in California is these justices are always up for confirmation and a vote of the people every 7 years, I believe it is.
Oh,
so they actually do come up.
I didn't know that.
They vote, and the people can reject them, which I think is actually a great thing.
Supreme Court, California Supreme Court justices.
Well, yes, both appellate court justices and California Supreme Court justices are subject to a vote.
So stateside, not federal judges, but state court judges. Yeah.
Yes. And in fact, we did, many years ago, I can't remember the exact year, but they did actually, it's not called a recall, but on the confirmation vote, they, took out two state Supreme Court justices by a vote of the people.
When did that happen?
I believe it was Rose Bird was the famous or infamous, if you will, Chief Justice that in a case sort of ruled that the death penalty was unconstitutional. And the people rose up and said, no, we want the death penalty. Actually, that's a great segue to modern day politics, where Gavin Newsom, when he came in as governor, summarily ended the death penalty for all intents and purposes, said he wouldn't carry it out, even though the people have, threw out a previous Supreme Court chief judge over that very issue and have actually voted on it multiple times statewide and confirmed that they want to have a death penalty. But apparently the will of the people doesn't matter when it comes to Gavin Newsom and what he knows is best.
It's because he thinks people are dumb. He thinks he knows better, and he should decide.
Yes, because he alone can fix it.
He's an egomaniac.
It's interesting. I haven't really paid much attention to the judicial branch in California. I don't think I'm alone in that. It's interesting. It's something we should look into more. Can we talk about? So you think this might be resolved one way or another in the next couple of months? What then? What if they just? What are the practical consequences if they rule in your favor? What does that mean?
If they rule in our favor, then he will have an injunction against him that he can no longer take these type of legislative acts. It'll be the only thing that really handcuffs him from doing these kind of, broad sweeping changes to law under an emergency. Hopefully the emergency by that time is actually over. But it will certainly put the handcuffs on him and any future governor. Because, to us, it's never been partisan. It's about respecting our rule of law and ensuring that there is a balance of powers and a separation between the branches.
But it won't actually change the law. So that would need the legislature. But would it create a precedent in terms of, I don't know, like you can't go indefinitely with the, it wouldn't put a time limit in because you need the legislation.
It wouldn't put the time limit in, but it would certainly put limits on what the governor's powers are during an emergency. And this is another
that he can't enact laws.
And this is another issue, Steve, is there really has been no case law on California's Emergency Services Act, because as you can imagine, usually emergencies don't last very long.
Right.
And so by the time somebody brings a case and everything, it's like the issue's already over. And so we don't really have a lot of precedent. That's why this case is so important, is that we need to have some precedent in place that draws the lines on what a governor can do during an emergency. And then there's also legislation. Like I said, Kevin and I are trying to change the law legislatively.
That's the really pathetic. I cannot believe that the pusillanimous, ridiculous legislators who are so cowed by the
stand up for yourself.
Exactly, it's their right. I mean, it's
at least stand up for yourself and your institution.
I mean, if you think again at the national parallel, because so often our conversations go to the national level. You see in Congress, you see Pelosi, for example. I've over the years, both when Obama was there, now with Biden, is asserting Congress's rights versus the president. And of course, they're the same party. They work together. They amplify each other's messages. I get it, but you definitely there's no. I don't think you'd. It's not automatic that just because you're the same party but in a different branch, you just completely kind of cave when something like this happens.
Right.
It's unbelievable.
I go back to
pathetic.
Thomas Paine. There's no time for sunshine patriots. And the time to stand up for all these things that we say we believe in about, limited government, separation of powers, liberty, is when they're under attack. And when these things are actually being violated and abused, you've got to be willing to stand up and do something about it. Apply these principles.
Yeah. Well, I think let's switch to I want to talk about what you've been working on in relation to wildfires as well, particularly with your personal background on the issue. But let's quickly talk about the recall, because that's going to be, a lot of the energy behind that was from the same kind of resistance to what was being imposed through the pandemic, school closures in particular. What's your assessment of where we are now on the recall? We've just had this news this week that they've taken one step out of the process so that it looks like they want it sooner rather than later. Where do you think we stand right now on the recall?
I still am very optimistic. And as I said, Kevin and I in the legislature decided to stand up and do what we could to stop these abuses. Meanwhile, a whole lot of just ordinary Americans, Californians said, enough is enough, and we're going to start this recall petition drive. And it was this amazing grassroots effort, across the state that grew into this movement and ultimately qualified as an official recall. What just happened recently is, the governor and his allies in the legislature, who we talked about can't really stand up for themselves, but seem to be willing to bend over backwards for this governor, just passed legislation that changes a law that they passed 4 years ago to help protect a Democratic senator when he was under a recall, to kind of, draw out the process and make it longer. They decided, well, now we want to change it to allow, this recall election to happen faster, because they believe that a recall election that happens sooner in time will benefit the governor. So they changed that law, allowing there's a required review period on the cost of the recall election of 30 days that through this piece of legislation they were able to bypass, and they're hoping to have this election sooner in time. I don't really, to me, honestly, it doesn't matter if it happens in 3 months or 6 months. I think the people are ready to recall this governor, and the same people who were motivated to put together those, 1.7 million signatures to qualify this. 1.9 million signatures to qualify this recall are going to be ready to turn out, along with a whole lot of other people who have been upset with the mismanagement, the corruption from this administration, and recall this governor. And that's, we have different ways of dealing with abuses. I really feel like this could be the most fundamental one. Well,
I agree. But to be honest, the polling doesn't suggest that. It suggests that actually it's been moving away for the last few months. Do you just think that doesn't reflect the reality, or what's your take on that?
I think there's been different polling out there. I mean, the PPIC poll, I think, is the one that people often point to. And the problem with that PPIC poll is it doesn't look at likely voters in the recall election. It's a much more broad-based view. And some of the polling that's out there that, that the party has done, for instance, that's looked at likely voters has the recall much closer, more like, almost dead even. And honestly, I think that it's really going to boil down to, who shows up and turns out in this election. And I can tell you there's a lot of people motivated right now to turn out and recall this governor.
I think the other thing, my take, just from my sort of political campaigning background, is that when you had the worst of the lockdowns, and people really kind of fed up with that, particularly the renewed round of closures, the outdoor dining in December, that kind of stuff that really infuriated people. The endless ongoing school closures that were clearly driven by the union corruption. When you had right across the country schools opening, you had so much evidence that it was unnecessary from any kind of scientific or public health perspective or whatever. So you had this real kind of rage about that stuff. Okay. It's got to receded from the news, because now the news is all about vaccinations and herd immunity being reached in certain parts of the state, if not all of the state, etc. And so it's a different story. Opening up, it's the summer or whatever, Disneyland, But actually, once you get into the recall campaign, once it's an actual recall election with a date and there's campaigning and the candidates are out there with their ads, and that's what has to be covered in the news. That the news reporters and the news bulletins will cover that. And that means that all of those arguments will resurface and people will be reminded of why they were so angry about all of that stuff. It will actually come back. So I think that is one thing, that the dynamic will shift somewhat. Can I ask you what you think about the argument that one of the problems for the recall effort is that there isn't one clear kind of leading candidate in the way that you had Schwarzenegger last time?
Well, look, I think that the reality is you want people to turn out and vote yes on recall. And I think there will be people that like different candidates, to be the replacement. But ultimately, what really matters is that people turn out to say, we need someone different. We need to make a change in the governorship. I don't know that, the way this race is shaping up, I don't know that it really necessarily matters that you have one person that's like an Arnold Schwarzenegger. And by the way, he wasn't that good of a governor anyway. In terms of a lot of things passed in the state that I think, are plaguing us to this day. But bottom line is, I like
Arnold. I gotta defend him. We love him.
Yeah, I'm a fan.
He's a great guy, and he had a Democratic legislature, and I think he feels very, stymied by. So you can't.
Just some policies that I was.
You can't rip on Arnold on our show.
Everyone's fair. We have a good argument. There's no ban on any kind of. We're not canceling anyone.
I would say the biggest one for me and for what I've seen is these mandates on emissions and the carbon policy that he really was the one who brought that to California. So meanwhile, China and all these other countries are emitting like crazy. And, I can't have a manufacturing plant move into my one of my cities that desperately needs the jobs. Those are some of the things that I would point to. I can agree with you. I think there was other things that he was great on. And obviously taking down Gray Davis was something that needed to be done. But my point is, I don't think you need like a superstar, one candidate to rally around. We need to remind people of what this governor has done. Not only the things that went wrong, but by the way, none of it applied to him. When your business got shut
I
down,
really agree with that. Yeah.
He went to the French Laundry. When your kids were out of school, his kids were in school because they were in a private school.
Yeah.
So none of this stuff applied to him. He was the privileged elite. And I think people need to be reminded of that as well. And just the gross mismanagement. Not only did this guy shut down your jobs, then he couldn't even pay you unemployment.
I know.
And meanwhile, prisoners were getting it. People on death row were getting it. $30 billion of fraud went out instead of people who desperately needed that money. And now this guy's going to make up for that by spinning a wheel.
I think there's a lot of material for those candidates to use. And then on top of that, like we keep hearing, more and more stories of out and out corruption. Actually under the emergency powers, awarding these contracts with no bid, no normal process, handing out contracts to donors. I mean, real corruption.
Right.
That I think, a lot of these candidates, if they know what they're doing, need to make a real fuss about, because I think people just hate that kind of stuff, and it's not well enough known.
And there are strong candidates out there that I think are making headway. And, people will rally around the fact that we need to make a change, and may the best, man or woman win in terms of the candidates that are out there running to replace this governor.
What about when will they set the date? Sorry.
Yeah, same question. Same question.
Because I think that's going to help the candidates. Like, they need to know when it's going to be so they can, smartly spend their time and money. So do we know when a date will be set?
I read that it could be as early as the end of this week, that there's an actual date set. And I believe that date is set by the lieutenant governor.
Yeah.
So she is the one that will kind of announce, has to be within a certain time frame. I think a lot of people are thinking it could be late September, mid to late September or October. It just
Kristen,
depends.
you were saying earlier you thought it could be Labor Day. Is that realistic?
Yeah, the soonest it could be after Labor Day. I think the elections committee, are saying that we can't do it that quickly, but it could be that fast.
And that is an important thing. Is right now our state elections officials, who are made up of county elections officials throughout the state, are saying, look, we literally can't put together an election and operate it unless this thing is after mid-September.
Okay, that's interesting.
Which Kevin pointed out yesterday on the floor, Kevin pointed this out, I think, really effectively is, when you try and rush an election in a way that, nobody's ready for it, candidates haven't had time to campaign, voters haven't gotten a chance to really understand who's running and all the issues. That's the kind of thing you get dinged on by the United Nations for, running a corrupt election. This governor and his allies need to be very careful in how they go about this and ensuring that we have a straightforward, fair, and not rushed election that everybody can participate in.
And this isn't the hand waving. I mean, they submitted a very, well-written letter saying, just look at the logistics of it. We can't recruit that many volunteers in time if we rush it too much. We can't get the ballots printed. We're not even sure what the rules are of this election. So there's a lot that has to happen easy now before you try to rush this to be around Labor Day.
All right.
We'll see if he listens.
Yeah. I'm not optimistic. Well, we'll see. What about the? I want to talk about wildfires. We've got a few minutes left, and I wanted to get just to hear what you've been working on there. It's obviously a huge issue for the whole state, but you have that really terrible experience with Paradise. Tell us what you've been doing on that.
Yeah. So we've had these catastrophic wildfires that I think everybody is familiar with. But what has been problematic is, when the Democrats talk about this, they always want to blame the ultimate boogeyman. It's climate change, and it's really not our fault. This governor appeared up in my district after a fire and declared war on gas-powered vehicles, and actually did another executive order banning them by 2035. That was his way of responding to wildfire. The reality is it's a problem decades in the making, mostly by Democratic lawmakers who have made it impossible to do any kind of forestry management and fuel reduction in our forests and wildlands. And to the point where now we do have, dead and dying trees, underbrush in some of these forests, 9 foot, 10 foot tall, that whenever you have any spark, whether it comes from a lightning strike or a PG&E power line, you have a conflagration that incinerates everything in its path. You have to get on top of the fuel problem. The governor keeps saying he doesn't like climate deniers. Well, I'm tired of fuel deniers. We need to get out there and do this work. I've been a big proponent of doubling down on these efforts, which are actually good climate policy, by the way, also, because when you get out there and do this, you have a healthy forest that takes in carbon, sequesters carbon rather than emitting carbon, not to mention these fires that have emitted millions of metric tons of carbon over the last 5 years. So we need to do that work, but the Democrats have, been the ones that haven't been willing to put in the continuous, sustained funding, mostly because of their environmental allies at Sierra Club, special interests who don't want to see any of this type of work done. They don't want to see any kind of environmental streamlining this work done. So we've been really pressing that. We called out, then NPR just last week called out the governor because the governor had been touting how he'd been doing all kinds of work on wildfire prevention. Well, as it turns out, it was another bogus claim from this governor. He said he'd done 90,000 acres and he had actually done 11,000 acres of treatment. When we need, all experts agree, we need 500,000 acres treated every year to really get on top of this problem. But it's easier for this governor to blame, President Trump when he was in office, or some other actor, instead of doing the work that we know needs to be done.
I remember when I first looked into this, so there's a lot of the argument about the ownership of the land. That most of it is most of the land that we're talking about is federally owned or privately owned, and a very small proportion is owned by the state of California. So when that figure of 500,000 acres a year for fuel, earmarked for fuel reduction, way more than we're actually doing, is that across all types of land?
Well, and that's true. There is way more federal land that our forests are on and these wildlands are on. And that is why we need a partnership. And actually, they reached one. 3 years ago, the governor and the president reached an agreement on federal land that they would both partner with what they call good neighbor agreements.
Yep,
So ultimately,
I saw that.
each of them would do 500,000 acres of treatment a year. Obviously, we haven't kept up with that. The federal government needs to do its part too, and I'm 100% behind holding the federal government accountable to doing this work as well. But we haven't really been doing our end of the bargain. And in fact, in this latest budget, they talked about doing $1 billion worth of work. The budget we just passed yesterday has $258 million in it.
Wait, that's a new piece of deception, because I remember when I was looking into that NPR story about and we had a previous guest, Michael Schellenberger, who was talking about the fact that Gavin Newsom cut the budget for fuel reduction and forest management and fire prevention. He cut the budget by 150 million. But that was in 2019, 2020, in the run up to last year's fires. And then the counter argument, and that's true. That's on the record. He did cut the budget.
He did.
But now he's saying that's like this 1 billion figure was put out there. Are you saying that it didn't end up being what he announced 1 billion? But are you saying it ended up being 200? What did you say? 200? What was it?
Yeah. Well, so back up. Last year, the reason why we didn't have any money going in last year is because the cap and trade fund. Have you heard of the cap and trade fund here in California? It didn't produce enough revenue. And so that was what they were using to put money into wildfire prevention. And so they just decided, it didn't produce enough revenue, so we're not going to put the money in.
And for those who don't know, that's essentially a gas and electricity tax. Yes?
Yes. I mean, essentially, yes, because you pay more at the pump because of these regulations that are put on by cap and trade.
Right.
And you pay more for your electricity and all which was brought on initially by your guys' friend, Governor Schwarzenegger. I will just point out, but, and we've had this policy that I think is very arbitrary, that increases our cost dramatically. But this cap and trade fund that they set up didn't produce the revenue that they thought it would. And instead of backfilling that and saying this is a priority because we've had fires for the past 5 years that have been devastating, maybe we should make this a priority with general fund money. They just didn't fund it. Then this year, in what they called early action funding, they paid that money back from last year and then called it, some big increase in spending that they were doing on wildfire prevention. Well, no, you just did what you were supposed to do last year. And then in this budget, he said he was going to do $1 billion package Actually, in May, in the May revise, he said it was going to be a $2 billion package.
That's right.
And when we looked into the details of that, he was counting money that he was spending on the Cal OES Equity Fund and earthquake preparedness, and all these things had nothing to do with wildfire. He was counting as part of a $2 billion package. When you get down to the brass tacks, it's $258 million, nowhere even close to $1 billion.
Wait, this is so interesting. So he announces $2 billion.
Right.
But then it did come to one in the original budget recommendation. Is that right?
In the original budget recommendation, he said $1 billion.
$1 billion.
His May revise, a couple months ago, he said it's going to be $2 billion.
That's when the revise was actually we've got more money than we thought because of the capital. Exactly. All right. So more tax revenue coming in. It's not as bad as we thought. So he announced his one. He does the May revise and said, no, but good news. It's now 2. Right. And now it's 258 million.
It's 258 million.
That's 1/8 of what he said.
258 million that does the cutting out the brush, removing dead and dying trees, all the stuff that actually has an impact on fuel.
So is there 2 billion being spent on something? Or is that
yes?
Because we're missing a comma.
But it doesn't have anything to do with wildfire prevention. It has to do with a lot of other stuff that they decided to fund. But that's how this governor operates. I mean, he did the healthcare core. We're gonna have this healthcare core that's gonna go out there and provide additional health resources to people throughout the state. It produced like 20 people, right?
We never hear about really, what it really reminds me of. I don't know if there's anyone listening who was around in the UK at the time. This is exactly the kind of thing you got from the Labour, from the sort of Tony Blair, Gordon Brown Labour government. It was like there's so much sort of spin and smoke and mirrors and announcing things and re-announcing them and initiatives or whatever, and then no one ever follows up, and it just all falls apart when you really pull the threads. But I mean, no one ever really bothers to do that, and especially here in the state, because you've got the like we've talked about this before. There's just not enough scrutiny. There's not enough media.
I got another great example, Steve. The other big thing he's touting is how he's helping all these tenants from getting evicted. And he's helping all these landlords, and he goes, we're going to do another $1.6 billion of funding to help those people not get evicted. Well, that program that he announced, they found out that only $61 million has been expended out of $1.6 billion. There's only been 61 million expended and only 5,000 applicants.
And you know where? Oh my God.
And we just did in this budget yesterday another $1 billion that we're putting on top of this to help with tenant eviction. And meanwhile, the program hasn't even been fully utilized today as it is. It's again, and they'll put that money out there saying they're doing all the stuff. When it doesn't get utilized, they'll pull it right back into the general fund and use it for something else.
Yeah, it's really, wow. And I was going to say, but they must be spending money on something. And you know what they're spending money on? It's actually payoffs to their donors, the teacher unions and the prison unions and all the rest of it. That's who I bet you their money never gets cut in this way.
The policies that get passed tend to favor them, and school closures is probably the biggest one. I mean, basically everything CTA wanted.
I think there's a whole, there's a whole story in here, Kristen. We should do an episode or maybe even a feature on this kind of budget. What I don't know. I'll think of a catchy name for it. Like what is, like looking into these numbers that are just announced and then something completely different is actually what happens, because it's such a theme of how they operate. Last thing, James, I just wanted to leave on. I hope a positive note. Just going back to the wildfires. I mean, do you have legislation? What can we hope for positively in terms of wildfires? What would be a solution? And is there any chance of that happening?
Yeah, 2 things. Right now, we're pushing for what's called continuous appropriation in the budget. So, hey, let's make sure that we appropriate this money every year, no matter what. That every year we should be putting in this, let's call it this 258 million is what's in there this year. Well, we should do that every year, and make sure that money gets out. We need to do that. and then remove the environmental barriers. Like we have this thing called CEQA, California Environmental Quality Act. Well, many of these fuel reduction projects have already been through an initial environmental review. But anytime you want to add additional acreage, you've got to do a full-blown another environmental review.
Do you mean add acreage for fuel reduction treatment?
Yes. Right.
We keep using that phrase. Just what does that mean? Does that mean people going into the forest, because it's pretty tough to do and it's manual, right? And going in, and is it what we think, which is literally chainsaws and chopping down?
Manual and machines that go in and remove the brush that's built up. You know, in some cases it could be 9-10 feet tall. Yeah, and removing trees, you know, usually like smaller trees that are causing a huge overcrowding in an area, right? So that when you have a fire, that'll be a low burning fire that just burns the forest floor essentially, and doesn't crown up into the trees and become this huge catastrophic wildfire. Yeah, and also prescribe, in some places you do prescribe burning. You burn the areas so that you get all that stuff out of there. And
so what you're saying is that the other thing that needs to change is you need to, every time you want to add a new acre for fuel reduction, that has to go through an environmental review.
Right. And then it gets subject to lawsuits and it gets held up. I mean, it's a very burdensome process that makes it harder for you to do this work. And we all know needs to get done.
And you have legislation that would exempt. Is it just as simple like we exempt fuel reduction from CEQA? Is that as simple as that?
It's as simple as that. That would be an easy policy that we can adopt.
Great.
That many people are on board with, but this Democratic legislature refuses to pass. Well, I mean, ultimately,
what would be the objection to that?
It is another special interest thing. I mean, Sierra Club has a lot of influence over committees and committee staff. And usually, I mean, it's very hard to get a CEQA exemption. The only thing we've done it for here in California, here's another problem. We do it for big stadiums.
I was going to say, that's right. Yeah.
You know, we do it for those kind of special interest projects, but we can't do it for water storage, which, gosh, we would certainly need that right now. And we haven't done it for wildfire
prevention. If we were being fair to the Sierra, you know, like we don't have them here, we should get them on. But like, what's the argument? Is it what is the argument against fuel reduction?
I think that their argument is they scare people into, this is going to bring back clear cutting, you know, just wiping out entire forests. And of course, that's not what this work does. It doesn't remove every tree. It just does the removal of the brush and thins out the smaller trees.
Yeah. I mean, I remember seeing when I was looking into this, you get that sort of, there's a side-by-side picture of a healthy forest and an unhealthy one. And an unhealthy one is where you just have row upon row, all the same, you know, very densely packed trees, all the same size, basically aligned, like sort of standing in a row with all the trunks and then the crowns at the top. Yes. Whereas a healthy forest, you have a mixture of different types of tree, small, medium, high, thinner, not so densely packed, and different heights, so that it doesn't just immediately go up to the top. Yeah,
exactly. So it's I love using that. I use that that photo a lot because it really drives it home for people that, you know, and this is what you want, and that's a better place for wildlife.
I was going to say, because I think my guess would be, you know, the argument from the environmental point of view, organizations like the Sierra Club will be, well, ecosystem protection. If you chop down all these things, but isn't it? It's a healthier forest. It's better. It's a better ecosystem as well as preventing fires, isn't it?
Yes, it absolutely is, and that's an argument that we make a lot. I mean, this debate has been going on for years. I mean, and it kind of goes back to the spotted owl, like when they really put a ban almost on any logging on the federal lands. Since that time, you've just seen they're not really allowing you to do much, if anything at all. And we've seen this huge growth of brush and undergrowth.
Well, look, we're going to keep talking about it because it's obviously a huge issue. We'll leave it there, James, for today. But like, I just want to say you're fighting some really important battles on many fronts, and it's just great to hear you lay out what you're doing, and we wish you well with all of it.
No problem. I'm glad to do it, and thank you guys, man. It's an honor to be on the show. I appreciate the work
Well, please come back. We're here for the long term. You know, we like we say, we want to.
I'd love to come back on again. You know,
there'll be many more opportunities. I can promise you that. James, great to see you. Thank you.
All right, great to see you guys. Thank you.
All right, thanks for joining us, and come back for the next California Rebel Base.